Hi everyone, I'm Thea Quiray Tagle, and I'm the curator of Afterlife that's now on view at YBCA and online. Over the next 2 months, I'll be having a series of short conversations with artists from the exhibition about their strategies of future thinking and survival. Today I'm going to talk with Courtney Morris, who is a visual artist and performer, as well as an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at UC Berkeley. So in this Solastalgia series that we're presenting in Afterlife We Survive, Courtney explores the complexities of race, place, memory, ecology, and the search for home. Solastalgia is what Courtney calls a mourning diary for the town of Mossville, Louisiana. If you could tell me a little bit about Mossville, right, this beautiful place that your family has such deep roots in. Could you tell me a little bit about why this place is so important or meaningful to you and your family?
So Mossville is a really it's an interesting place because it's a place that I think, when I was growing up as a child, I didn't think that Mossville was particularly important. I didn't really understand the value and the beauty of that place until, in many ways, until it was already imperiled. But Mossville is it's a fascinating place. So the community is located in southwestern Louisiana. It's just a few miles north of the city of Lake Charles, which, as many people may know, was recently devastated by Hurricane Laura, and is one of the kind of key industrial sites in the state of Louisiana in terms of petrochemical production in that part of the country. And so Mossville is really interesting because it is a historic freedmen's community. So it's overwhelmingly Black. When I was going there as a child, I don't think I ever saw a white person who lived in Mossville or spent a lot of time in Mossville. It was an entirely Black community. So the schools were Black, all the local churches were Black, all the businesses were Black owned. And it was a very kind of small and very tight knit community of Black families who had lived there for generations. I know in my family, on my grandmother's side, people have lived in that community since the mid 19th century, following the end of the Civil War. So, I can go, as I've been doing research on the family, I've found land grants that people had received. My one great grandfather and another great great grandfather both received land grants after the Civil War that they lost many years later due to corporate trickery. But, we're talking about people who've lived in this area for some people upwards of 150 years. So it's a really old Black community. It has very deep roots. And, it's a place that was sort of a refuge for Black people after the Civil War. It was kind of like a place where people could go and sort of be, in a way, shielded from some of the most excessive and brutal forms of white supremacy in the region. And then in the 1930s, as the petrochemical industry began to develop in the Gulf South, it became this sort of locus for the placement of a variety of different petrochemical facilities. So there's like vinyl manufacturers and, people who are converting natural gas into different kinds of substances. There are oil refineries. There's a range of industries that have set up operations there since the 30s that made this place, ultimately unlivable. And so for me, but as a kid growing up there and going and visiting my grandparents there, it was just where my people were from. And it's a place that's been really important and formative in my own sort of development as a creative person, but also as someone who thinks a lot about the environment in both my creative and my scholarly work. And so, in 2012, a South African petrochemical company called Sasol basically was able to broker an agreement with the state of Louisiana to build a massive facility there that would require a complete buyout of the town. And that sort of, that was really kind of the nail in the coffin for the death of that community. And that was really, for me, what prompted me to start really taking Mossville seriously and making work about it.
This series, Solastalgia, for me as a witness to it, is both about memorializing, right, and really reckoning with all of this deep loss that has happened and continues to happen there, at the same time as it is uplifting the continued resilience, right, of folks like your grandmother, Mrs. Freeman, who, I know has now passed, but was very much right, engaged in so many kinds of care work for you and other younger people, and part of these larger structures that, have kept the community alive, in spite of, and in the midst of everything else. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this kind of care work, this kind of mothering, right, that you see happening, or that you are part of yourself, in terms of, right, not just Mossville and this particular project, but also in terms of, just different kinds of creative projects to expand Black femme futurity.
This project was so special to me because I did get to make so much of it with my grandmother, and I did really get to learn a lot about, this was a woman, she was born in 1933. She was born 2 years before the first petrochemical facility was built around Mossville. She saw all the companies kind of come and go. She was there when people in the community began to organize against the environmental racism that they were faced with, against the pollution and the destruction of the community. And, her social memory of what happened to that community and how Mossville was made to die, and ultimately the way she experienced that in her own body as a cancer survivor, was, her memory was just so deep and rich. And I don't think before I started making this work that I really understood just how brilliant she was. And, I think that the kind of care work that Black mothers do is what keeps the community alive in conditions of constant violence and death, right? So, I think that part of it is true that Black communities all over the world are constantly battling against forces that are literally trying to kill us. And the work that Black women and Black mothers do in terms of, taking care of families, in terms of care for elders, in terms of care for the land, is the work that keeps us alive. And it may be that, in a lot of ways, because that work, it just looks like the everyday work of survival, that we don't always recognize how critical and crucial that work is to our survival. But I think working on this project really made me take that work seriously in a way that I had not done before. And that now that I'm in the process of, becoming a mother, I find that I also am thinking a lot about, well, what is the work that I have to do, to protect my own Black life, but to also to create conditions in the world where the Black life that I am creating can survive and can flourish, And so there's something about just like that balancing act, I think, of that care work that is about attending to the reality of the violence, but also constantly working to hold a space where you can imagine a different kind of future beyond that.
And so maybe just as the last kind of question I wanted to ask is, for yourself, for Mossville, for other places that matter to you, what's your ideal future? What is the, future that you hope to see?
I've been really in my, I teach a class at Berkeley called Environmental Ethics. And one of the texts that I like to assign in that class is work by an anthropologist named Anna Singh, who writes about the foraging practices of people who eat the matsutake mushroom. And it's a particular kind of mushroom that only grows in landscapes that are kind of devastated. You can't really cultivate it. It can't be farmed. It kind of chooses where it wants to grow. And it does a particular kind of rehabilitative work in landscapes that are kind of devastated. And, she talks about this, the value of looking at this mushroom as a kind of ecological metaphor for how to create life in capitalist ruins. And I think about that a lot with places like Mossville, like that community has been so devastated by the kind of combined forces of capital expansion and white supremacy. And I think about what it would mean, like, if maybe 100 years from now, people return to this place and decide to make life there, what would that look like? Is it possible for a place like Mossville that's been so destroyed and ruined in so many ways? Um, would it be possible for people to go there and to create life again? And I guess I think in a lot of ways, I look at the work that I'm making as like, if that were to happen, here are some blueprints for what life used to look like in this place. You know,
Mhm.
that people used to live here and they had families here and they had churches here and they had businesses here and people had raised their children here. And it's not to say that those communities were unproblematic or that there weren't issues that needed to be dealt with, but that all kinds of forms of social life can flourish here. you know and so I guess that would be my hope for Mossville, that I don't know what kind of futures will exist in that place, what kind of futures people will create there, but I'd like to think that that there is something that comes after death. That's a part of my spiritual practice. It's certainly a sensibility that informs my creative practice, and I'd like to hope that even if this iteration of life in Mossville has ended, that there might be a place that people could return to at some point and make life there. I think that's what I would dream of or envision or hope for a place like Mossville.